They say that war teaches you who you truly are. For Captain Aldrich Brennan, that lesson came not on the grand battlefields where armies clashed beneath banners of cloth and blood, but in a burned-out village where the only witness to his transformation was an orc woman with eyes like molten copper. The village of Thornhaven had once been prosperous. Stone buildings with thatched roofs lined the main street. A small marketplace sold wares from across the kingdom. Children had played in the fountain at the village square. Now there was only ash and silence and the acrid smell of smoke that had cooled 3 days ago. Aldrich walked through the ruins alone, his armor catching the pale afternoon light. At 28, he had served in the human army for 7 years. He'd risen through the ranks not because he was the strongest or the most ruthless, but because he could think several moves ahead, could see the shape of a battle before it unfolded. He was a strategist, a planner, a man who solved problems with his mind rather than his sword. But no strategy had prevented this. No planning could undo it. He had led the defense of Thornhaven against the orc incursion, following orders from high command. Hold the village, they'd said. Deny passage to the enemy advance. His garrison of 40 soldiers against a raiding party that turned out to be over 200 orcs. They'd fought hard. Many of the villagers had fled north, but not all. The old, the infirm, the merchants too stubborn to abandon their homes. They'd hidden in the cellars and caves surrounding the town. The orcs had burned the village to drive them out. Aldrich found the bodies in what had been the temple. 23 of them. They hadn't been killed in battle. They'd been herded into the building and the doors had been barred from outside. The heat had done the rest. Some of the bodies were so blackened that he couldn't tell their age or gender. A small shoe, barely bigger than his palm, lay among the ashes. He knelt there for a long time, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his hands shaking. This was the cost of war. This was what civilization meant when it sent soldiers to hold the line. A sound behind him made him turn, hand instinctively moving to his sword. But the figure in the temple doorway didn't advance. She stood still, her green skin streaked with ash, her massive frame outlined against the dying light of afternoon. An orc warrior, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that suggested years of violence. Her armor was leather and iron, scarred from use. A massive cleaver hung at her side. Aldrich slowly stood, positioning himself between the bodies and the orc. His sword came free from its sheath with a whisper of steel. "Come to finish what you started?" he asked, his voice hollow. The orc warrior did not draw her weapon. She studied him with eyes that were an unsettling amber gold, and when she spoke, her voice was deep and rough, accented but clear. "I did not start this." She gestured at the temple interior with something that looked like regret. "This was not battle. This was the word in your human tongue, murder." Aldrich's grip on his sword tightened. It was a trick, obviously. The orcs had learned to mimic human speech to seem reasonable. It was another weapon in their arsenal. "You're part of the war band that did this," he said flatly. "You might as well finish me." "I could," the orc said. She took a step inside the temple, and Aldrich raised his sword, but she showed him her empty hands. "But I will not. Look at me, human. Look at my face." Against every instinct screaming at him, Aldrich did. He looked at the broad green face with its prominent jaw and curved tusks. He looked at the scarred brow and the small pointed ears. And then he saw what she was trying to show him. Tears. Amber eyes streaked with tears, running down weathered cheeks. "What is your name?" the orc woman asked. "Aldrich," he answered, despite knowing he shouldn't engage. "And you?" "Kestra. I am the third daughter of Vorag, warlord of the Rockish tribe." She looked at the blackened bodies on the temple floor. "This was wrong. My father did not order this. Kale, one of the commanders, did this to prove something. To show strength," he said. "To demonstrate the price of resistance." Kestra's hands clenched into fists. "I could not stop him. When I raised my voice, I was—" She paused, searching for words. "Cast down. Shamed in front of the warriors." Aldrich didn't lower his sword, but he didn't attack either. "Why are you telling me this?" Because you need to know that not all of us, Kestra gestured helplessly, not all of us agree with this, with burning villages, with murdering those who cannot fight. I am a warrior. I am trained in war, but I am not a murderer. That's a nice philosophy, Aldrich said bitterly. It doesn't bring them back. Something in his tone made the orc woman flinch. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that shocked him. She turned and walked away, her massive frame moving swiftly toward the temple door. She paused at the threshold and looked back. There is a shrine, half a day's journey north of here, in the mountains where the path becomes narrow. It sits between human territory and ours, untouched by the war because both sides fear the curse that supposedly haunts it. It is a place where we could speak without soldiers seeing. If you wish to understand why I tell you these things, come at sunset 3 days from now. If you do not come, I will understand. I will know your people cannot trust mine, and that perhaps I am foolish for hoping otherwise. Then she was gone, and Aldrich was alone again with the dead. He told no one about the encounter. When his relief force arrived the next day, he filed his report, explained the losses, coordinated the burial of the dead in a mass grave north of the village. He worked mechanically, speaking only what was necessary, eating little, sleeping less. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts and emotions. 3 days later, as sunset painted the mountains gold and purple, Aldrich found himself saddling his horse. It was madness, obviously. The orc woman was likely leading him into a trap. Even if she was sincere, meeting with her would be treason. He could be executed for fraternizing with the enemy during wartime. There were a dozen rational reasons not to go. But in the temple, he had looked into the face of something that war had created, indiscriminate death. And in the orc woman's eyes, he had seen something else. The rare glimmer of a conscience that had somehow survived in the forge of violence. So he rode north, alone and armed, toward the narrow mountain pass. The shrine was older than Aldrich had expected, built of stone so weathered it seemed to be reclaiming itself back into the mountainside. Carvings covered its surface, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. They showed figures locked in what might have been combat or might have been embrace. He couldn't tell. The shrine's purpose had been forgotten by time, which perhaps made it a fitting meeting place for those trying to transcend their own era's divides. Kestra was already there, sitting on the shrine's lowest step. She rose when she saw him, moving with a warrior's grace that seemed almost delicate for someone of her size. In the fading light, her green skin looked almost luminous. "You came," she said, and he heard genuine surprise in her voice. "I must be as mad as you are," Aldrich replied, dismounting. "We're on opposite sides of a war." "Yes," Kestra agreed. "We are, and perhaps that is why we must meet. Have you heard what the War Council say about us? That you're barbarians? That you breed in the deep places and swarm out whenever an orc warlord gets ambitious? That you have no culture, no art, no capacity for anything but violence?" Aldrich shook his head. "Pretty standard recruitment material." Kestra's laugh was unexpected and surprisingly musical for someone with such a deep voice. "And we are told that humans are parasites who spread like a plague, that we are weak and corrupt, that your civilization is built on slavery and stolen lands." She moved closer, slowly, giving him time to back away if he chose. "None of it is true, I think. Or rather, all of it is true for some and false for others. People are not so simple as their enemies describe them." They talked through the night, sitting on the shrine steps as stars wheeled overhead. Kestra spoke of her childhood in the mountain holds, of learning to fight from age 6, of the rigid code of honor that governed orc society. She told him about the councils where war strategy was debated, and how the more moderate voices were increasingly drowned out by the blood-hungry calls of warlords like Kale. Aldrich shared his own story. His training as a soldier, his advancement through the ranks despite his preference for planning over fighting, the weight of command that came with knowing that decisions made in comfortable tents would be paid for in blood on distant battlefields. "I was supposed to hold Thornhaven," he said quietly as the first hints of dawn began to gray the eastern sky. "I was supposed to do what others do without question. Fight, hold ground, accept losses. But I looked at the burned bodies in that temple and I couldn't accept it anymore. Kale told me before the raid that this was the nature of war, Kestra said. That mercy was weakness. That fear was a better strategy than honor. And I believed him, or I thought I did. But when I saw what his words had made him do, she trailed off, shaking her head. I challenged him, called him dishonorable before the assembled warriors. He broke 3 of my ribs and said I was unfit to be a warrior. If another had not stood with me, he would have killed me. Who stood with you? My brother, Torvin. He is younger but skilled. Kale did not want to fight both of us. Kestra paused. My father has returned to the deep holds, disgusted by what the war had become. I am banished for all practical purposes. Too dangerous, too uncontrolled. I was told I could join another war band or find my own path, but I could not return to my father's tribe. The implication hung between them. Kestra had nothing to lose by meeting with him. She was already outcast from her own people. What will you do? Aldrich asked. I do not know yet, Kestra admitted. I think the war will end soon. Not in victory for either side. In exhaustion. Both our peoples grow tired. The human realm suffers from internal politics as much as orc conflict. Your rulers cannot agree on whether to push for total victory or negotiate. My father and other chieftains are at odds. Nothing can continue forever, and this war has already gone on too long. You could come with me, Aldrich heard himself say. There are lands to the south, beyond the reach of either kingdom. We could. That is a beautiful dream, Kestra interrupted gently. But you know it is not possible. You are a human officer. I am an orc warrior. If we were seen together, it would not matter what we claimed about peace or understanding. We would both be branded as traitors and executed. Then what? Aldrich's voice was harsh with frustration. We meet in secret at a cursed shrine and talk, while our peoples kill each other. Perhaps, Kestra said. Or perhaps we do more. Aldrich, there are others like us. Humans who have come to doubt this war. Orcs who are sick of bloodshed. What if we could bring them together? Not as soldiers, but as something else. A voice for peace. A path toward negotiation. That would never work, Aldrich said. But even as he spoke, he was thinking about it. The young human officers he knew who questioned orders. The refugees from orc territories who had fled the war, not as soldiers but as families. There were more cracks in both societies than the war councils wanted to admit. You are right, Kestra agreed. It likely would not work. But we must try something or the killing never ends. In your temple, those children died for nothing. They will not be the last unless someone is brave enough to try. They made a plan as the sun rose. Aldrich would use his position to begin spreading doubts about the war, carefully, through trusted allies. He would gather information about which human commanders had become skeptical about the conflict. Kestra would return to her tribe and seek out orcs who shared her doubts. In 3 months' time, they would meet again. And if you are captured? Aldrich asked as they prepared to part. Then I hope you will continue without me, Kestra said. As I hope you would do the same, if the situation were reversed. But neither of them truly expected to survive. They were setting out on a path that would end in either execution or miracle, and they both knew it. The next 3 months were among the most difficult of Aldrich's life. He had to maintain his position in the army, following orders and performing his duties as a captain while simultaneously working to undermine the war effort from within. It was a delicate balance. One misstep, one careless word, and he would be discovered. He began by identifying the officers who shared his doubts. Some were obvious. Captain Reneth, who had lost an entire battalion to what Aldrich could determine was a completely unnecessary strategic maneuver. She began eating alone in the officers' mess, isolating herself. When Aldrich sat with her one evening, she didn't turn him away. The war is costing us more than it's gaining, he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. I've been analyzing the supply lines, the casualty rates. We're bleeding resources. Our economy is beginning to suffer. Reneth looked at him carefully, clearly weighing whether this was a trap. "That's not the kind of talk that gets you promoted," she said finally. "No," Aldrich agreed. "It's the kind that gets you executed. But I'd rather die having tried than live knowing I did nothing." That started the chain. Reneth introduced him to other officers who had begun to suspect that the war could not be won and should be negotiated. There were fewer of them than Aldrich would have hoped, but enough to form a foundation. They started carefully circulating documents about the economic cost of the war, nothing explicitly treasonous, but clearly advocating for a reassessment of strategy. Meanwhile, Aldrich's work with supplies gave him unusual access to information. He began creating detailed maps of the Orc territories he'd accessed through military intelligence reports. He studied the tribal structures, the patterns of Orc settlements. He learned everything he could that might help him understand the internal divisions that Kestra had mentioned. At night, he carved a small figurine from wood. It showed two figures, human and Orc, reaching toward each other across a chasm. It wasn't particularly good, he wasn't an artist, but it gave him something to focus on, a physical manifestation of the impossible thing he was trying to achieve. When the 3 months had passed, Aldrich did something that would have been unthinkable to his younger self. He deserted. He left a letter saying he was ill and needed to return to his family estates in the south. It wouldn't hold up to serious investigation, but it would provide a few days of confusion before his absence was noticed and reported as desertion. He rode hard toward the shrine, not knowing if Kestra would be there. For all he knew, she had been executed by her own people for her doubts, or captured by the humans, or simply changed her mind about the futility of their scheme. She was there. Kestra was leaning against the ancient stone shrine as the sun reached its peak, her massive frame somehow seeming smaller than it had before. She had injuries too, a fresh scar along her left shoulder, and the way she moved suggested that her ribs, the ones that Kale had broken, hadn't fully healed. "You came," she said when she saw him, and relief flooded her amber eyes. "I was not certain you would. I was not certain I would." "What happened?" Aldrich asked, dismounting. "My brother and I gathered others. Orcs who were tired of war, who questioned the warlords. Some were young, like us. Others were old warriors who had seen too many seasons of blood." Kestra moved carefully toward him. "We met in secret, as you did with your people, and we were discovered. Kale's loyalists attacked our gathering. We fought. Most escaped, but some." Her voice caught. "My brother Torvin was among those who did not." Aldrich pulled her close without thinking, and she let him, her massive body seeming to find shelter in his arms despite their difference in size. They stood that way for a long moment, two people on opposite sides of a war grieving the cost of trying to end it. "We cannot keep meeting like this," Kestra said finally, pulling back slightly. "It is too dangerous. We must move forward or abandon this entirely." "I've brought maps," Aldrich said, moving to his horse to retrieve them, "and a list of human officers who are willing to negotiate. Some are in the High Command, which gives us access to decision-makers." Kestra nodded grimly. "And I have something better, a neutral ground. There is a settlement in the borderlands, a place where merchants from both humans and orcs have sometimes traded before the war became too fierce. Still exists hidden in the highlands. The merchants there have declared themselves neutral, loyal to neither kingdom. If we could gather representatives there, both human and orc, away from the ears of the war councils, we could negotiate in earnest," Aldrich finished, "without the pressure of armies and politics." "It is very dangerous," Kestra warned. "We would be announcing our location to any spies. We would be giving our enemies a target." "This whole thing is dangerous," Aldrich replied. "But you're right. It's also the only chance we have." What followed was a whirlwind of secretive movement and careful coordination. Using the networks, the negotiations began cautiously. The first sessions were held in separate tents, with Aldrich and Kestra carrying messages back and forth. Slowly, the trust built. Reneth spoke with the Orc Elder about shared values regarding the protection of non-combatants. The bishop found unexpected common ground with the shaman about spirituality and the nature of honor. The female warrior and Torvin, though they had fought against each other in battle, discovered mutual respect for martial skill and a shared disgust at the ways the war had devolved into the slaughter of civilians. After 5 days, they began to meet together. It was Tesai who suggested the final step, a binding agreement, not just a promise of negotiation, but a formal commitment signed by all parties. If we are serious about this, she said, then we must show the kingdoms that we are willing to stake something on peace. Money, position, reputation. Anything less and they will treat us as a passing nuisance rather than a serious movement. The document they drafted was eloquent and dangerous. It called for an immediate cessation of hostilities between the human and orc kingdoms, to be enforced by an independent coalition of neutral merchants and interested parties. It demanded the establishment of border towns similar to the merchant settlement, where trade and cultural exchange could occur. It required both kingdoms to establish formal peace councils with representatives on both sides. And, most radically, it called for the creation of a joint military force composed of both humans and orcs, specifically tasked with preventing any future conflicts between them. They will call us mad, the bishop said as he signed. They will call us traitors, the orc elder agreed. But the alternative is continued war, and my people are weary of it. When all had signed, Aldrich and Kestra made a decision. They would take the document to both kingdoms themselves, personally, making themselves responsible for its delivery and, by extension, answerable for its contents. This is suicide, Reneth said flatly. You'll both be arrested the moment you cross into your respective territories. Probably, Aldrich agreed. But if they're not willing to listen to us, then the document dies anyway. If we try to deliver it through channels, it gets buried in bureaucracy. But if we arrive in person, if we force them to look us in the eye, then we have a chance, Kestra finished. Even if it kills us, we have tried. Isn't that what you said matters? They split up to do what they had to do. Kestra went to the deep holds where her father Vorag held court. Aldrich rode to the capital where the human king sat in judgment. Aldrich's arrival at the capital caused an immediate uproar. He turned himself in to the guards at the city gate, and within hours he was in a cell awaiting execution for desertion and treason. The trial was brief. Desertion in wartime carried an automatic death sentence. Treason against the crown was even worse. The only question was the method of execution. But then King Aldemir himself requested a private audience. The king was older than Aldrich had expected, perhaps 60, with gray streaking his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years of command. He studied Aldrich for a long moment before speaking. You left your commission, the king said. You gathered officers and encouraged them to question orders. You worked with the enemy to draft proposals for surrender. For peace, Aldrich corrected. Not surrender. The document calls for mutual cessation of hostilities, not for either side to yield. Semantics, the king said dismissively, but he didn't order the execution. Instead, he leaned back in his throne and asked, Why? Why would you throw your life away on something like this? Aldrich told him. He described Thornhaven, the burned bodies in the temple, the child's shoe in the ashes. He spoke about meeting Kestra and discovering that the enemy had doubts and conscience. He outlined the plan, the gathering, the document. And you expect me to accept the terms of a treaty drafted by officers and merchants and a woman who leads orc warriors? King Aldemir demanded. I expect you to consider them, Aldrich said, because the alternative is another 10 years of war, another 10,000 bodies in temples. Another generation growing up hating each other for no reason except that they were taught to. The king was silent for a long time. Then he asked, And the orc woman? Kestra? I don't know if she succeeded, Aldrich said. She was taking the document to her father, to Vorag. If he refused her as I feared he might refuse you, then she's probably dead. If she survived. He left the thought unfinished. King Aldemir stood and walked to a window that overlooked the city. I have ruled for 23 years, he said. 14 of them have been during this war. I have sent more than 100,000 of my people to die in this conflict. Do you know how many battle victories we've achieved? Do you know how much territory we've gained? The reports suggest minimal strategic advancement, Aldrich said carefully. Minimal, the king repeated bitterly. We have 17 settlements and perhaps 2,000 square miles of territory. For that, we've spent enough gold to feed half the kingdom for a decade. We've lost enough soldiers to fill 10 cities. And the Orc kingdom has achieved similar gains at similar costs, yes. By all accounts, yes, your majesty. Then we are fools, the king said flatly. Every one of us who has continued this war is a fool. He turned back to Aldrich. Your desertion is still treason, but I'm commuting your sentence to exile. You will take your document and you will go to the border settlements. And you will wait there. If the Orc warlord Vorag also commits to these terms, then we will send representatives to begin true negotiations. If he doesn't, if your Orc woman dies in the attempt, then you can die knowing you tried. It wasn't a reprieve. It was a suspension of execution. Aldrich spent the next week in a state of anxious waiting. He was given supplies but not freedom. He could leave the city, but there was an implicit understanding that returning would mean immediate execution. He went to the borderlands and, with help from sympathetic merchants, made contact with the neutral settlement. That's where he learned about Kestra. She had reached her father's holdings, the deep mountain beneath which Vorag's tribe maintained their vast cavern system. She had presented the document to her father in front of the assembled elders and warriors. Vorag had listened to her arguments. And then, according to the report that reached Aldrich, Kale had challenged her claim that the war served no purpose. They had fought, hand-to-hand combat in the traditional way, a formal duel to settle the disagreement. Kestra had won, but the victory had cost her. Kale's blade had opened a terrible wound along her ribs, and though she had killed him, the poison on his blade, a common Orc practice, had nearly killed her as well. Vorag had summoned the shamans. They had worked to cure her with their ancient magic, using herbs and chants and the desperate will of warriors who still loved her. She had lived but barely, and her father, seeing his daughter willing to risk everything for the sake of peace, had signed the document. The relief Aldrich felt was overwhelming. When the messenger brought word that both kings had committed to negotiation, that official representatives were being sent to the neutral settlement, that a formal peace conference was being arranged, he wept openly for the first time since Thornhaven. Kestra arrived at the settlement a week later, moving slowly and carefully, still recovering from her wound but alive. When she saw Aldrich, she let out a sound that was almost a laugh and limped toward him as quickly as she could manage. You convinced your king, she said. And you convinced your father, Aldrich replied. You're alive. Barely, Kestra admitted. Kale's poison was stronger than we realized, but the shamans are skilled, and I am stubborn. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. What happens now? Now we see if peace can actually work, Aldrich said. The representatives will arrive in 3 days. The formal conference will begin. And if we can get both sides to a negotiating table, to sign the accord that we drafted, then we may have done it, Kestra finished. We may have actually stopped the war. The peace conference lasted 6 weeks. There were arguments and disagreements, moments where it seemed like the whole thing would collapse. But the presence of Aldrich and Kestra, sitting together during sessions, occasionally translating not just words but concepts and perspectives, seemed to anchor the negotiations in something real. They weren't abstract arguments from distant war councils. They were two people who had risked their lives because they believed peace was possible. When the Treaty of Three Paths was finally signed, a formal accord establishing the terms of peace and the framework for future cooperation between the human and Orc kingdoms, King Aldemir and Warlord Vorag both added their seals to a second document. It granted Aldrich and Kestra a unique status. Official peace ambassadors with their own small territory and full authority to establish the border towns and trade settlements that would serve as the bridges between the two kingdoms. But more than that, it granted them something more personal. A blanket pardon for any crimes either had committed, and the right to marry according to the customs of whichever culture they chose, with full legal recognition in both kingdoms. The first border settlement was established 2 years after the peace treaty was signed. They called it Bridgeholm, and it was built with materials and workers from both human and Orc territories. The architecture blended human stone buildings with Orc-style carved caverns. The streets ran in patterns that followed both species' aesthetic preferences. The marketplace sold goods from human craftspeople and orc artisans side by side. Aldrich and Kestra's wedding was held there, in the central square, with King Aldemir on one side and Warlord Vorag on the other. They wore robes that incorporated elements of both cultures, and they exchanged vows in both languages. The celebration lasted 3 days and was attended by thousands of people from both kingdoms, marking the first time such a gathering had occurred in peace. Over the next decade, 5 more border settlements were established. Trade flourished. Cultural exchanges became common. Young people from both species began to study together, to work together, to build lives together without the shadow of war hanging over their heads. There were still problems. There were still people who clung to the old hatreds, who sabotaged negotiations, who attacked mixed communities. There were politicians and generals who resented the power that Aldrich and Kestra had accumulated. There were ideological conflicts that wouldn't be resolved quickly, if ever. But there was no war. The killing had stopped. And that, as the old shaman told Aldrich one evening, was not a small thing. Aldrich and Kestra eventually settled in Bridgeholm, building a house that was uniquely theirs, part human design, part orc craftsmanship, with rooms scaled to both their needs and their children's, for they did have children, through a process the healers said should have been impossible but somehow wasn't, the result of magic neither species had fully understood. They established schools where human and orc children learned together. They created a body of texts documenting both cultures, so that history would record not just battles and conquests, but the art, philosophy, and values of each people. They worked quietly but persistently to transform the relationship between the two kingdoms from a fragile cessation of violence to something that might, in time, become genuine cooperation. It wasn't the kind of peace that appeared in history books, marked by grand treaties and ceremonial moments. It was the peace that came from thousands of small choices. Merchants trading fairly, soldiers standing down instead of standing ready, families who had lost people to the war choosing not to seek vengeance, young people building lives across old boundaries. Aldrich sometimes returned to the shrine where he had first met Kestra. He would sit on those ancient stones and think about the moment when he had turned to see her standing in that temple doorway. How different his life would be if she had chosen to kill him instead of speak to him. How many thousands of people owed their continued existence to that single moment of mercy and curiosity. On the 20th anniversary of the treaty, they returned to that shrine together. Aldrich brought the wooden carving he had made all those years ago, the one with 2 figures reaching across a chasm. He had refined it over the years, polished it, made it smooth. It was his best work. "Do you regret it?" Kestra asked him, the same question she had asked him countless times over their years together. Aldrich looked at the figure in his hands, at the 2 beings forever reaching toward each other, forever bridging that impossible gap. He thought about the people they had helped, the lives that had been saved by peace, the children who would grow up in a world without this war. "Not for a single moment," he said, and as the sun set over the mountains, painting the ancient shrine gold and crimson, Aldrich and Kestra stood together, 2 impossible people who had somehow made the impossible real. 50 years after the Treaty of 3 Paths, historians would debate whether Aldrich and Kestra had truly saved the world or simply prevented it from destroying itself. The answer, of course, was both. In the decades after the formal peace, the 2 kingdoms developed what scholars called the asymptotic harmony, a relationship that never achieved perfect unity but continually moved closer to it. Trade networks proliferated. Cultural exchanges became commonplace. Intermarriage was no longer shocking, though it remained relatively rare. There were reverses. There was a period of conflict in the eastern regions, when warlords from a 3rd kingdom tried to exploit the peace to expand their own territory. But when human and orc forces stood together against this external threat, something changed in the collective consciousness of both peoples. They had stood side by side not against each other, but against a common enemy. And they had chosen to remain together even after that enemy was defeated. By the end of Aldrich's life, at the age of 87, the majority of people under 40 had never known a time of war between humans and orcs. To them, it was history, important to learn but not lived experience. The fear and hatred that had driven the original conflict seemed ancient and incomprehensible. Kestra lived to 92, her orc vitality giving her more years than her human husband. In those final years, she served as one of the high councils overseeing cultural integration, ensuring that the advances made were not lost to new generations who might take peace for granted. Their children, both human and orc, became leaders in their own right. Some worked in government, others in trade, education, and the healing arts. They had grandchildren and great-grandchildren from multiple partnerships and marriages, creating family trees that would have been unthinkable before the war. The house they had built in Bridgeholm became a museum after their deaths, preserved as a testament to the life they had built together. Visitors from both kingdoms would walk through those rooms, seeing the artifacts of two people's lives intertwined so completely that it was often impossible to tell which items belonged to whom. In the central chamber, displayed prominently, was the wooden carving that Aldrich had made the first night he carried the secret of his feeling toward Kestra. Beside it was a carving made by Kestra herself, far more skilled than Aldrich's, created when she learned the human art of whittling. It showed the same two figures, but from Kestra's perspective, reaching across the gap not with desperation but with hope. And in a glass case near the entrance was a small object that visitors rarely understood. A child's shoe, blackened by fire, recovered from the ruins of Thornhaven. It was Aldrich's way of ensuring that anyone who walked through his house would understand what the piece had cost to build, and what it had saved from destruction. The world that Aldrich and Kestra left behind was far from perfect. It had its own problems, its own conflicts, its own history of traumas both old and new. But it was a world where humans and orcs could work together toward common goals. It was a world where love between the species was possible, where cultural exchange was valued, where the possibility of war had been transformed into the reality of cooperation. In the end, that was their legacy. Not the treaty itself, which would be superseded by other agreements and revised by later generations. Not the settlements they founded, which would grow and change beyond recognition. But the simple, profound proof that things could be different. That enemies could become partners. That love could transcend the deepest divides. One human man and one orc woman had refused to believe the boundaries between them were absolute. And in that refusal, in that simple choice to see another being not as a monster but as a person, they had changed the course of history. It wasn't the kind of change that came from armies or revolutions or grand political movements. It came from conversation and understanding, from the willingness to listen to someone from the other side of a chasm, from the courage to reach across that gap even when it seemed impossible. In the end, perhaps that is what all great change comes from. Not from power wielded, but from connection offered. Not from victory claimed, but from bridges built. And somewhere in the mountains, where an ancient shrine stood weathered by wind and time, those bridges still stood. Invisible perhaps to the eye, but real in every life they touched, in every person who had chosen peace instead of war, in every moment of understanding that replaced centuries of fear. That was Aldrich and Kestra's gift to the world. A gift that would continue echoing forward through generations yet unborn, as long as people could choose to see each other as beings worthy of love, no matter the color of their skin or the shape of their faces. And that, in the end, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.